This is just a brief video ahead of the four main videos for Wednesday and Friday about information processing theory. I really want to spend just 10 minutes rounding out our discussion of behaviorism. And so where we left off is hopefully you all have a very good understanding of the two mechanisms of behaviorism that we talked about. So the process of classical conditioning, where we pair an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus until the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus and elicits the conditioned response. And operant conditioning, where we talk about different types of consequences that can happen, be they positive or negative punishment or reinforcement. And so in this kind of finishing up our discussion of behaviorism, I wanted to do two things. So first, I wanted to compare and contrast operant versus classical conditioning. And then I wanted to evaluate behaviorism overall as kind of a theory of learning, with a particular focus on operant conditioning, but also on behaviorism more broadly. And so just like I've done in the past, I want to give you guys just 30 seconds to see if you can come up with what's two contrasts between classical versus operant conditioning, as well as thinking about what these two approaches have in common. Okay, so let's talk through some of these. And so at their core, both of them are behaviorist approaches. And what that means is they both focus on ways that I, as a teacher, providing kind of environmental feedback can influence students' behavior. And so in both cases, they're really focused on behavior, and they see learning as just a behavioral process, a process of getting students to demonstrate certain behaviors. At the same time, the mechanisms are really pretty different. So while classical conditioning requires an existing set of an existing response, so an existing behavior through an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response, operant conditioning is really different, because while classical conditioning, there has to be something basically occurring before the target behavior, before the neutral stimulus. In operant conditioning, the feedback follows the behavior. So I don't have to start with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. I can just have students demonstrate the particular behavior and then condition after. And that conditioning after, as opposed to starting before with an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, is really the core differentiator between these two mechanisms of behavioral conditioning. Within classical conditioning, you can only produce the unconditioned response in terms of the behavior that students manifest. And of course, that unconditioned response then becomes the conditioned response. So I can only elicit a response that is existing. Whereas in operant conditioning, there's a much broader span of behaviors I can target. So any behavior that students manifest, even if that behavior isn't triggered by an unconditioned stimulus, is something that I can condition through operant conditioning. So by providing positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, presentation or removal punishment. In both cases, we're using the external to shape the individual. So I'll remind you of that little E impacting the I in the diagram you saw. So in all cases, we're looking at the effect of the environment on the individual. But there's a difference in terms of how aware individuals are of the conditioning. So one of the things that we talked about as potentially an ethical issue around classical conditioning is that it happens without the individual's knowledge. So when we, for example, pair the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus, students may not even be aware that we're conditioning them. They may not be aware of the contiguity there. Whereas operant conditioning is more conscious. When we provide feedback, we talked about pairing that reinforcement or punishment directly with students' behavior. And so in that sense, students are more conscious of the consequences of their behavior. Whereas because the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response are automatic, students are less conscious under classical conditioning. And of course, within operant conditioning, students are not just conscious of the feedback they're receiving on their behavior, they're also conscious of producing that behavior again, right? They're more willful in producing that behavior. Whereas classical conditioning, it's almost like students can't help themselves because it's an unconditioned response. It's automatic. So when we're talking about classical conditioning, we're always talking about behaviors in response to a stimulus. And so we're either talking about the unconditioned stimulus before conditioning, or we're talking about the conditioned stimulus after conditioning in terms of producing the unconditioned or the conditioned response. In operant conditioning, we again going towards this more flexibility point, not only can we produce certain behaviors, we can also increase or decrease or strengthen or weaken the behavior. So reinforcement and punishment are all about increasing the frequency of a behavior or decreasing the frequency of a behavior. And so we're able to manipulate those in a way that we don't with classical conditioning. And in both cases, and this is kind of a really important point that I want to emphasize with classical and operant conditioning, and I apologize, I know you can hear the phone ringing, is that in both cases, be they classical or operant conditioning, the behavior has to exist for us to condition it. So if there is not, in the case of classical conditioning, an unconditioned response that gets produced, I can't pair it with anything. I can't produce it in response to a conditioned stimulus. Likewise, with operant conditioning, if students aren't initially demonstrating some behavior, I can't increase its frequency. I can't reinforce it. And that's really important when we're thinking about how to instill certain behaviors in students. And we'll talk about that more in the next slide. But if I want students, for example, to raise their hand, I can't condition that if that behavior isn't already happening. So I can reinforce it once it happens. I can get students to do it more. But if it's not something that's produced by an unconditioned stimulus, or if it's not getting produced at all, then I'm not able to condition it. And so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of knowing what we do about classical and operant conditioning and kind of what these two approaches have in common, what separates them. I want you to think about what are the benefits of behaviorism, particularly operant conditioning, which we talked about as happening much more frequently in the classroom, and what are the limitations. And so again, I'll give you a couple seconds, see if you can think about two benefits and two drawbacks associated with this approach. Okay, and let me take you through some of these. So the first kind of takeaway that I hope you got is that it's very effective. The reason that we're still talking about behaviorism today is because it works. And in fact, all of us have been conditioned in a pretty powerful way. And I'm thinking back to the examples that all of you brought up when we first started talking about behaviorism in the classroom. And one of the things you guys said is, well, we all know to raise our hands because you guys have all been conditioned, probably through positive reinforcement, where when every time you raise your hand, your elementary school teachers probably said, thank you for raising your hand, now you may speak. Or you just got reinforced because by raising your hand, you were given attention, you were given the opportunity to speak. And so that's a really powerful ingrained behavior. But it's more than that. It's when you all come into class, all of you somehow knew on the first day, without me saying anything, that the thing you had to do was sit down and kind of face the front. How did you know that? Well, because you've been in classes lots of times and you've been conditioned to behave in certain ways. And so behaviorism is really powerful. In another example, all of you are probably dressed kind of similarly. So all of you are wearing kind of jeans or t-shirts, kind of casual clothing. And somehow none of you came in, for example, in a toga, or none of you came in just without clothes at all. None of you came in a bathing suit. And why would that be? Well, behaviorists would tell you that's because if you came in wearing something really strange, you would get negative feedback, right? People would say, what are you wearing? Or they would make fun of you. Whereas when you wear something that's kind of socially appropriate, or even better, kind of really corresponds to trends, you get positive reinforcement. People say, wow, I really like your outfit. And so when you think about it from that framework, behaviorism is really all around us. A lot of how we behave in kind of a conformist way is because we receive positive reinforcement for it, is because it's been reinforced. So behaviorism is really powerful and it's really effective. And so that's why we're still talking about it. A big benefit is that it really works. Particularly with operant conditioning, we can increase or decrease behaviors. And I want you to think about operant conditioning as really very flexible. And we talked about this in some of the examples we use, but a lot of times I'll use multiple aspects of operant conditioning. So at the same time as I'm trying to increase a behavior occurring, I'm trying to decrease a behavior that I don't want to occur. So I'm increasing raising your hand at the same time as I'm trying to decrease or punish calling out. And I have positive and negative punishments and reinforcements available to me. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And just like I said, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of my response options. So I can give you things you like, I can take away things you don't like, vice versa. I can give you things you don't like and take away things you do like. So that gives me a lot of different kinds of approaches to managing student behavior. And the last thing is that it can apply at a group level, particularly over classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is easier to do with a group. And that doesn't mean that you should dole out group punishments or group reinforcements. And we'll talk later in this class about why group punishments in particular may not be a great idea. You can think about it just kind of intuitively of, well, if somebody talks, the whole class gets punished, and how you feel as a student probably feels pretty unfair to you. But at the same time, particularly with positive reinforcement, I can do whole class rewards, or even if I'm reinforcing a single student, that sets a positive tenor for the whole class. And so being able to condition at a group level is really effective. At the same time, there's some serious limitations to think about. The first is what we talked about on the previous slide, where I can only condition behaviors that already exist. And so behaviorism doesn't quite give us the answer to how I can instill brand new behaviors. So kids come to the first day of kindergarten, they have no idea about the rules that all of us know as elementary school students. So you come in, you hang your bag in a cubby, you get your notebook and pencil ready to write, or whatever the procedure is. And so just like we talked about when we talked about reinforcement more generally, it can lead to students relying on that external reinforcement or punishment for behavior. And so we talked about how behaviorists don't really care about that, right? So if I'm a behaviorist, I don't really care that you rely on the reinforcement as long as you're producing the behavior. But at the same time, it may lead to students wanting an increased reinforcement. It may lead to extinction or the ceasing of the behavior demonstrated when reinforcements are no longer provided. So I want to be conscious of the fact that I am putting something external on students' behavior rather than explaining to them why they should be doing it or why that's an important behavior to do. A couple of things to think about related to these limitations. So the first having to do with the point that behaviors have to exist. And so your book goes into more detail about it, but I just want to mention it here. So although behaviors do have to exist, there's certain things that I can do to increase their probability of occurring. And so the first is kind of drawing on more classical conditioning approaches to develop antecedents or cueing of behaviors. So students may not always remember to produce a behavior. So for example, if we come in and we have to hang our bags up in our cubby and get our materials ready for class. And students don't remember to produce that behavior. It hasn't been habituated yet. What I could do is I could cue them to it. I could give them a behavioral antecedent. An antecedent just means it comes before the behavior. So I can say, okay, guys, what are the 3 things we do first thing in the morning? Or I could ring a little chime, and that cues students to do the 3 morning things that they are supposed to do. Another thing that we can do to help students demonstrate the behavior is called behavioral shaping. And that's when we move students toward the behavior we want to see. So for example, if you come into class and I want you to do 3 getting ready things, what I can do is I start with the first part, which is hanging up our bag. And at first I just reinforce hanging up the bag. And then we add something to it. So you hang up your bag and you take your lunch out and you put it where we put the lunches. And so through shaping, it's the gradual process of producing the behaviors that we want. So likewise, if I want a more complicated behavior, so participating nicely during group work, I can shape that behavior, which includes a couple components. So I can start by reinforcing you asking your seat partner what they think, right? So good participation in the group. And then from there, I can also reinforce if not only did you ask them what they think, but then you said, oh, I agree or I disagree in a respectful manner. And so by shaping or by kind of linking behaviors together, I can get students to the target behavior that I want to see. And so just a couple, so now that you have those terms defined, hopefully you have this conceptualization of how the two behaviorist approaches compare to each other, as well as the strengths and limitations of behaviorism. And so the big limitation that I'm going to talk to you about, and that's going to lead us into IP theory, is how can we condition cognitive things? And of course you can't. So if I want to teach you how to add or how to read or how to design an experiment in science, there's no real way for me to condition that through behaviorism, particularly if, going back to our first point, you don't already know how to do that, right? If that behavior doesn't exist, how can I teach you to do that? And so the next theory that we're going to talk about, which is IP theory, moves from this behavioral approach to learning to thinking about the cognitive aspects of learning. And I'll just stop there.